Hi everyone, it's Pastor Jen at York Baptist Church, and I am coming to you on this Wednesday, March 9th. This is our Wednesday study hour, and we're still working our way through Jennifer Davidson's River of Life Feast of Grace, Baptism, Communion, and Discipleship. We do meet in person on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. You are welcome to come and have these discussions, even if you haven't bought the book or even read any of it before. Just come. We've been having lively discussions on baptism and what it means to us and what our memories around it are, and it's been just very life-giving. Today's chapters, we are going through chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5 is titled Navigating the Waters, Questions of Practice in Baptism. And chapter 6 is a collection of different potential liturgies around baptism and infant dedication and affirmation of baptism. There's a lot to dig into. So Jennifer Davidson gives us these questions to think about before looking at the chapter. She asks, can you remember when you first became aware of baptism? Was that awareness before or after your own baptism took place? And we shared stories about our own baptisms, and one person said that she really only became aware of baptism because of Sunday school, and she watched previous classes get baptized, and it got to be her turn with her class. Another person had an infant baptism and couldn't really remember the first time you really thought about baptism. He remembered various baptisms in the church, and these are memories that he has shared in our group. I remember I was raised in a family that didn't attend church regularly, or actually didn't attend church at all. So the first time I had any conversation about baptism was like 5th or 6th grade, when my friends were questioning why I wasn't baptized. So everybody's going to have different experiences. Davidson also asks, what questions do you have about baptism and how baptism is practiced, either in your congregation or in churches that you have visited or been a part of in the past? And we said that, we're curious about the different traditions that other churches have, why some churches baptize infants, why some don't, why insist on some just do a sprinkling and some, like our tradition, had full immersion. Why on Easter Sunday? Things like that. There's a lot of different traditions around baptism. I think our conversation pretty much came to the decision that, we were just okay with however any particular church practices, as long as it is part of their loving community and it's meaningful to them. Davidson asks, if your baptism happened when you were old enough to remember it, can you also remember first sensing an invitation to baptism? Do you remember any particular people who influenced your decision? What factors went into your decisions to be baptized? Something that came up in our conversation was the fellowship involved. Say a Sunday school with a very good teacher that the youth trusted and felt compelled to have these conversations with. It was a big deal. It mattered when it came to making a decision about baptism. We talked about other people's baptism stories, memories of people that we've seen baptized, our own godchildren even. It was a time of sharing stories. And as we continued our conversations today, we thought about the benefit of sharing stories in worship about our memories around baptism, having a chance to testify about baptism. We don't get a lot of chance to talk about baptism in worship lately, mostly because we don't have a great deal of youth in our church, and so there aren't these frequent opportunities to see a baptism and to have those conversations around it. So what are some other ways that we could bring in this conversation on an ordinary Sunday? It was a creative and interesting conversation to have. Jennifer Davidson in this chapter talks about emphasizing baptism as a process rather than an event. And she writes this that I thought was interesting. She says, I think our churches could be much more intentional in thinking about baptism as a process that begins well before the event itself. While some churches may extend an invitation once or twice a year to young people to join in pre-baptismal classes, what if we deepened this experience by asking baptized members of the congregation to share a 3-minute testimony of when they began to sense God's invitation to baptism in their own lives? These testimonies could be offered every Sunday during the season of Lent, a time traditionally set aside for preparation of baptism in early churches. If this practice were done annually, how might it allow people to listen more deeply to God's invitations in their lives at other times? Hearing a variety of stories may help people perceive the many ways God moves in people's lives. It would be wonderful, she writes, to hear from people with powerful stories, but also people with very simple, almost ordinary stories. So often we privilege the stories of radical transformation that those with less dramatic stories feel inferior or may miss entirely the still small voice that leads to a loving relationship with God. I was thinking, what about the youth that decide, well, you know what, my friends are getting baptized, so I think I will too. And as I went through my pre-baptismal classes or on the day of my baptism, I really felt God present in my life. And that's it. That's the whole story, right? Jennifer Davidson offers a creative exploration as to bringing this baptism conversation in more frequently in worship. She also goes into a fairly in-depth conversation on infant baptism, where that comes from, why we have a believer's baptism, the differences between them, how to differentiate between infant baptism and infant dedication. She treats very well the history of infant baptism and how it was tied to the Christian religion as connected to the state and nations. And then kind of what happens during the Reformation. Martin Luther had encouraged lay people to start reading the scriptures and digging that apart a little bit. And when that happened, some Protestants in the Reformation looked at the early church and said, hey, the early disciples were not baptizing babies. This was an adult confession of faith. So there were groups that splintered off and insisted on adult baptism, and that actually got pretty ugly. I mean, there were people that died over that argument. Martin Luther was actually a proponent of infant baptism and saw infant baptism as a citizenship, because remember, we didn't really have Europe wasn't so much national. There were feudal systems that were evolving into nations, and having an infant baptized also provided them citizenship in the state. So it's a context that we don't really see. Our group talked about it. It was like, baptized babies, baptized believers, whatever church tradition is fine. Our group talked about the infant dedications that have been done here at York Baptist Church and how meaningful they were, and the aspect of both infant baptism and infant dedication can welcome a new child into the community, and the community makes a covenant with this child. We are going to wrap around you in God's love, and how beautiful that can be. Again, Davidson's book has some liturgies around infant dedication, and her emphasis is that it's not a baptism. It's different. And her liturgy in here helps make it different. There's a lot to dig into with that. I encourage you, if you can, get the book. It's really worth reading. We also talked about the differences in churches that rebaptize, which was an interesting conversation. What emotions are wrapped around that? Actually, Davidson asks a question about this. How do you respond to the story on pages 62 to 63 of being baptized 3 times? What emotions or reflections does this story bring up for you? And she talks about the fact that she was baptized a second time in a lake at a Christian festival called Jesus 83. And even though her first baptism was very significant to her, the 83 baptism was very profound. She talks about some of the inner process with that. I talked about my own dad, who had been baptized 3 times, once as an infant, once as a matter of conversion to get into my stepmother's church. And then he later took a pilgrimage to Israel and was baptized in the Jordan. And the Jordan experience for him was more of a profound spiritual experience, because it was the first time he felt that he had made this decision with Christ, to make that level of commitment. So there is a lot to wrap around that. We just had some very lively conversations around that, and most of that conversation was not condemning. We don't know how the Holy Spirit works in these things. We also talked about the affirmation of baptism and what an affirmation of baptism service would look like in our church. What would they like to see? We talked about pastors in the past that had a practice of continuously inviting people into baptism, and what it's like to have a pastor that does that normally versus not. These are the things that we talk about in baptism. And the biggest takeaway from today's conversation was story. We need to share our stories about baptism. What does it all mean? I mean, we're Baptists after all. Telling stories, having opportunities to have stories shared. We talked about we have to talk to our oldest members and have them share stories about their own baptisms or baptisms that they remember. Some of them have great-grandchildren. But what does that all mean to you? Story. Story is holy. Story is sacred. we are going to go into chapter 7 next week, and that brings us into Jennifer Davidson's invitation to talk about communion. Let's talk about what this thing is that we do once a month in most of our churches. Is it just something that makes service longer, or is it a deeply profound experience? Think about that. This week, Jennifer Davidson invites us to get stories from people in our circles about baptism. Go ahead and ask. Be non-threatening. Just say, I'm just curious. We're having this conversation with the pastor about baptisms, and I'm wondering if you have any memories. And then also this week, think about what communion means to you. Think about any emotions you have around communion. Think about the actual practice of it. Think about how pandemic has impacted that, as far as those little cups, or do you remember passing a loaf of bread around and just ripping a chunk off of that and passing it? Think about all the intricacies of it, so that we can start having some creative conversations around that. I do hope you have a good week. If you have any comments or questions, please post in the comments, either on YouTube or on Facebook, or you can email our church at ybchurchoffice@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. This has been a great conversation so far, and we look forward to continuing this conversation throughout the rest of Lent. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Be well, and think about spring. It's on its way. All right. Take care. Blessings to you. Bye for now.